All right, listen, before we even start naming names, you need to understand why this matters. Because this isn't about gossip. This isn't about drama for clicks. This is about how history gets shaped, how stories get edited, and how sometimes the most important parts of a story are the ones that never make it to screen. When Netflix dropped Sean Combs' The Reckoning, people watched it expecting closure. Like, okay, this is the definitive version. This is the full story. And for a minute, it felt like that. Heavy interviews, uncomfortable moments, a lot of stuff people hadn't seen laid out like that before. But then 50 Cent did what 50 Cent always does. He didn't argue with the documentary. He didn't walk it back. He didn't say Netflix got it wrong. He simply said there was more. And that one idea, that there were names, conversations, and entire directions that never made the cut, completely changed how people started looking at this documentary. Because once you realize things were removed, you stop asking what happened and start asking, why wasn't this shown? That's a way more dangerous question. So today, we're breaking down what 50 Cent has actually said about the names that didn't make it into The Reckoning, why certain celebrities keep coming up in public discussion, and what these exclusions tell us about how big this story really is. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're gonna understand why this documentary doesn't feel finished. It feels paused. Let's rewind. When 50 Cent announced he was producing a documentary about Diddy, people already knew this wasn't going to be friendly. There's history there, tension, decades of back and forth. So expectations were high. And when the series finally dropped, it delivered on intensity. But something interesting happened almost immediately. People weren't just reacting to what they saw, they were reacting to what they expected to see and didn't. That's a key difference. Then the interview started. 50 goes on record explaining that the documentary was limited to 4 episodes. He talks about how much material they had. He says, flat out, you had to pick and choose. That sounds normal, until you realize what that implies. It means footage exists that viewers haven't seen, interviews that were recorded but never aired, context that was discussed but ultimately removed. And here's the thing people miss. Documentaries don't remove random stuff. They remove things that change the shape of the story. So let's talk about the first name that keeps coming up, Justin Bieber. Now let me be very clear before anyone clips this wrong. No one is accusing Justin Bieber of anything. 50 Cent has not accused Justin Bieber of anything. This is about relevance, not wrongdoing. Justin Bieber's early career is one of the most documented in music history. His proximity to major industry figures wasn't private. It was public, televised, photographed, and openly discussed at the time. So when The Reckoning avoided that entire era, viewers noticed, not because they expected scandal, but because they expected context. If you include Bieber, you have to talk about youth in the industry, about mentorship, about how young artists navigate power, about what environments looked like back then. And that's not a footnote. That's an entire new chapter. Once you go there, the documentary stops being about one man's decisions and starts being about how the industry operates as a whole. And from everything 50 has said, that wasn't the documentary he was trying to make, at least not with Netflix. So Bieber wasn't removed because of controversy. He was removed because including him would have blown the scope wide open. And that's a pattern. Next name people keep circling back to, Meek Mill. Again, not accused, not alleged. This is about why fans expected his name to come up and why it didn't. Meek represents the modern era of hip-hop politics. Once you include Meek, you're talking about social media narratives, public alliances, activism, loyalty, and how power looks today. That changes everything. The Reckoning is largely retrospective. It looks back. It examines history. It doesn't try to resolve the present. Including Meek would have dragged the story forward, forced modern commentary, and invited immediate backlash and responses. That's not something you casually add to a documentary already walking a tightrope. So again, exclusion equals control. Now let's talk about Usher, because this one's fascinating for a completely different reason. Usher is respected across the board. He's not controversial in this context, but Usher represents something subtle and dangerous to narratives: environment. If Usher were included, the documentary would have had to answer questions about what was considered normal at the time, about how young artists were introduced to fame, about what people accepted without questioning. That's a cultural conversation, not a personal one. And once you start talking culture, accountability spreads. So leaving Usher out wasn't about avoiding a name, it was about avoiding a shift in responsibility. Now here's where things really start to click, because when you look at the names fans think were removed, you realize they're not random. They're connective tissue. They connect eras. They connect systems. They connect power structures. Including any one of them would have forced the documentary to widen its lens. And once you widen the lens, you lose narrative control. Now let's talk about something nobody likes to admit: legal reality. Big documentaries don't just care about truth. They care about response, clearance, right of reply, risk. Including certain names doesn't just add content, it adds obligation. You have to give people a chance to respond. You have to prepare for legal scrutiny. You have to be ready for counter narratives. And 50 Cent understands that better than most. He's been sued. He's been targeted. He knows exactly how thin that line is. So when he says names were removed, some of those decisions were probably creative, some were probably strategic, and some were probably about survival. Now let's talk about why 50 is saying this now. He didn't say this before the documentary dropped. He didn't say it during the rollout. He waited. That timing matters because saying it now doesn't overshadow the documentary, it extends it. Now people aren't just watching The Reckoning, they're rewatching it, pausing it, analyzing what's missing. That's how you keep a story alive. 50 isn't feeding the fire directly. He's letting oxygen do the work. And here's the genius part. By not naming everyone explicitly, he avoids making claims. He avoids headlines that force rebuttals. Instead, he lets the audience connect dots. That's how you control a narrative without owning every conclusion. Now let's zoom out. This isn't just about this documentary. It's about how history gets retold in the streaming era. Back in the 90s, stories stayed local, rumors faded, interviews disappeared into magazines. Today, everything is archived. Everything is searchable. Everything can be replayed, reframed, and questioned. 50 Cent is operating in that reality. He's not rewriting history. He's reopening it. And when you reopen history, you don't get neat endings. You get friction, discomfort, debate. That's exactly what we're seeing now. And that's why this story isn't dying. Because The Reckoning doesn't feel like a conclusion. It feels like a prologue. The real takeaway isn't who was left out, it's why. Because once you understand why certain names were excluded, you start to see how massive this story actually is. Bigger than 4 episodes, bigger than one platform, bigger than one documentary. And that's why people keep asking if more footage will ever surface. Because now the audience knows it exists. And once people know something exists, they don't stop asking. And here's another layer that hasn't been talked about enough. Audience expectation versus creator intention. Because when a documentary like this drops on Netflix, viewers subconsciously expect it to function like a final verdict. Like, okay, this is the official version. This is the story we're supposed to walk away with. But 50 Cent never framed The Reckoning that way. From the jump, he positioned it more like a chapter, not the whole book. And that disconnect is where a lot of the tension comes from. Viewers wanted completion. Netflix marketed it like closure. But 50 seems to be saying, this was never meant to be the end. That's important because it reframes everything. Suddenly, the removed names don't feel like omissions. They feel like deliberate pacing, like holding something back because the moment wasn't right, or the platform wasn't built for it. And honestly, that's something we don't talk about enough with streaming documentaries. Netflix isn't neutral. It has a brand, a tone, a risk tolerance. And once you understand that, you realize certain conversations were never going to make it onto that platform, no matter how relevant they were. Which leads into the next segment. Let's talk about how power reacts when it's named, even indirectly. One reason certain names likely stayed out of the documentary is because naming powerful figures doesn't just create controversy, it creates response. Statements, PR, legal teams, media cycles. Suddenly, the story isn't about reflection anymore. It's about damage control. And 50 knows that. He's watched this industry long enough to understand how quickly narratives get hijacked once powerful people feel exposed. Even without accusations, just being mentioned can trigger pushback. So by choosing not to include certain celebrities, 50 didn't weaken the documentary. He protected its message. He kept the focus where he wanted it, instead of letting it spiral into 20 different side battles. That's not fear, that's strategy. And you can tell it's strategy because of how casually he's discussed it afterward. He's not defensive, he's not apologetic, he's matter of fact. Like, yeah, that wasn't the place for it. Which brings us to the third and maybe most important new segment. What happens next? Because once a creator publicly acknowledges that material exists outside of a finished project, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Now fans aren't just watching the documentary, they're watching 50. They're paying attention to interviews, to captions, to side comments, to what he chooses to address and what he ignores. And that creates a slow burn anticipation that's arguably more powerful than a surprise release. So let me ask you this. Do you think The Reckoning told the right version of the story for the format it had? Or do you think the names that were left out matter more than the ones we heard? And if 50 ever decides to revisit this story without limits, does everything change? Let me know in the comments. Because one thing's for sure, this conversation isn't over. It's just getting started. And if more comes out, you already know we'll be right here breaking it down. Anyway, this concludes today's video. Be sure to subscribe to LoafTube for future celebrity videos, and turn on that post notification bell so you don't miss out on any future uploads. Until then, see you in the next one.